Welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to explore a really pivotal period, the U.S. occupation and reconstruction of Japan after World War II.
Right.
Our main source is a historical overview from the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian, and it covers 1945 to 1952. What's fascinating about this period is it's not just about rebuilding, it's about a complete transformation of Japan.
It really is.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to rebuild an entire nation's identity from the ground up, politically, economically, even culturally.
Wow.
That was the challenge facing the U.S. in post-war Japan, and the decisions made then still have repercussions today.
You mentioned that the groundwork for this transformation was actually laid before the war even ended. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. The Allied powers weren't just focused on winning the war, they were already thinking about what a post-war Japan would look like.
Okay.
Wartime conferences like the one in Potsdam were crucial. They used these conferences to hammer out the terms of surrender, including the demand for unconditional surrender from Japan.
So in a way, the stage was set for the occupation before the curtain even fell on the war.
Right.
And then enter General Douglas MacArthur, right? He becomes this almost larger-than-life figure in the story of Japan's reconstruction.
He really does.
Yeah.
As the supreme commander of the Allied powers, or SCAP MacArthur, had an incredible amount of authority.
Wow.
While there was an Allied Council with representatives from Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China, its role was largely advisory.
Okay.
The U.S. was firmly in the driver's seat.
From what I've read, MacArthur's initial focus was punishment and reform. Did that approach achieve its intended goals?
Well, demilitarization was definitely a key focus. War crimes trials were held in Tokyo, the Japanese army was dismantled, and former military officers were barred from political leadership.
Right.
This is about breaking the cycle of militarism that had led to the war. But whether it truly eradicated militaristic tendencies is debatable.
And it wasn't just about undoing the past, it was about building a new Japan from the ground up.
Yeah.
Land reform, for instance, seems like a pretty radical step.
It was.
What were they hoping to achieve with that?
Land reform was a major initiative aimed at empowering tenant farmers who had often been exploited by wealthy pro-war landowners.
Okay.
The goal was to redistribute land, creating a more equitable society. And it wasn't just about land. There were also attempts to break up the Zaibatsu, those massive family-controlled conglomerates that held a lot of economic and political power.
I'm curious about the Zaibatsu.
Sure.
Can you give us a specific example of one and how these policies impacted them?
Take Mitsubishi, for example. They were a huge Zaibatsu with interests in everything from shipbuilding to banking.
Wow.
The occupation authorities tried to break them up into smaller independent companies, but the process was complex, and some argue that it wasn't entirely successful.
So even in this push for reform, there were complexities and perhaps unintended consequences.
Right.
But let's talk about the new constitution introduced in 1947, which is still in effect today.
Okay.
I've heard this was a really radical shift for Japan.
Absolutely. The 1947 Constitution brought about some monumental changes. The emperor, who was once considered a divine figure, was reduced to a symbol of the state with no political power.
Wow.
Real power shifted to a parliamentary system. It's a huge departure from Japan's imperial past.
For a nation with Japan's militaristic past, renouncing war as a sovereign right was a monumental step.
It was.
It makes me wonder how they managed such a profound shift in their national identity.
It was a complex process, and some argue that it was more about pragmatism than a genuine change of heart. But regardless of the motivation, Article 9 of the Constitution, which renounces war and the right to maintain offensive military forces, remains a cornerstone of Japan's pacifist identity today. And another significant change was the granting of more rights and privileges to women, including the right to vote.
Okay.
This is a huge step forward for gender equality in Japan.
Okay, so we've got this new constitution, land reform, the dismantling of the Zaibatsu. It seems like Japan was really on a path towards a more democratic and equitable society.
Right.
But then things took a turn, right?
Yeah. This reverse course you mentioned earlier, what prompted that shift?
By the late 1940s, a number of factors led to what historians call the reverse course. Japan was facing a severe economic crisis.
Okay.
Inflation was out of control, raw materials were scarce, and markets for Japanese goods were limited. On top of that, the Cold War was heating up, and the U.S. was increasingly worried about the rise of communism in Asia, particularly in China.
So the focus shifted from reforming Japan to making it a strong ally against communism.
Yeah.
But what did that look like in terms of actual policy changes?
Well, instead of continuing to break up the Zaibatsu, the U.S. began to see them as potential engines for economic growth. They started pouring resources into rebuilding Japanese industry, easing restrictions on production, and encouraging trade. They also began to rearm Japan, albeit in a limited way, to help counter the perceived communist threat.
So in a sense, the U.S. was prioritizing short-term stability over the long-term goals of democratization and demilitarization.
I think so. It seems like a classic dilemma in foreign policy. How do you balance immediate concerns with the potential long-term consequences of your actions?
It's a dilemma that policymakers grapple with constantly.
Right.
And in the case of Japan, the reverse course had some significant and perhaps unintended consequences.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. I mean, I mentioned rearming Japan.
Yeah.
But didn't they just renounce war in their new constitution? How did they reconcile those two seemingly contradictory positions?
That's a great question. It created a lot of tension within Japan. Some argued that any form of rearmament violated the spirit of Article 9, while others maintained that a limited self-defense force was necessary for national security, especially given the escalating Cold War tensions.
So how did this debate play out? Did they ultimately amend the Constitution to allow for a larger military?
Not exactly. Instead of a formal amendment, they opted for a more creative interpretation of Article 9. The government argued that having a self-defense force, or SDF, focused on protecting Japan from external threats, didn't violate the Constitution's renunciation of war.
It sounds like they found a way to thread the needle balancing their pacifist ideals with the realities of the Cold War.
Yeah.
But this reverse course, this shift in priorities, did it have any impact on those early reforms, like the efforts to break up the Zaibatsu?
It definitely did. With the emphasis now on economic growth and stability, the push to dismantle the Zaibatsu lost momentum. In fact, some argue that the reverse course actually allowed these large conglomerates to regain their footing, leading to the reemergence of powerful corporate interests that still hold sway in Japan today.
So some of the old power structures may have reasserted themselves, even as Japan was undergoing this profound transformation.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is rarely a linear progression. There are often twists, turns, and even reversals along the way.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the reverse course wasn't without its critics, both within Japan and internationally. Some argued that it betrayed the initial goals of the occupation, while others saw it as a necessary adaptation to the changing global landscape.
And then, of course, there's the Korean War, which breaks out in 1950. How did that impact Japan, especially given its new role as a U.S. ally and its ongoing process of reconstruction?
The Korean War had a profound impact on Japan. It became a critical supply depot for UN forces fighting in Korea, which actually ended up boosting its economy. The war also solidified Japan's position under the U.S. security umbrella, further easing fears of external threats and allowing it to focus on economic development.
It's fascinating how a conflict like the Korean War, which was obviously devastating for Korea, could have such a complex and in some ways positive impact on Japan's trajectory.
It highlights how interconnected global events are and how even the most destructive conflicts can have unintended consequences, both positive and negative. And for Japan, the Korean War served as a catalyst for its rapid economic recovery and its integration into the Western Bloc during the Cold War.
Okay, so we've talked about the reverse course, the Korean War, and the lasting impact of these events on Japan's development. Now let's move on to the final phase of the occupation, securing the peace. What were the key events and decisions that marked this phase?
By 1950, the U.S. perception of Japan had fundamentally changed. It was no longer seen as a former enemy, but as a crucial ally in the Cold War.
Right.
The goal now was to formalize peace and end the occupation. This led to the San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed in 1951 by 49 nations, including Japan and the United States.
This treaty was obviously a major turning point. Did it fully resolve all the outstanding issues from the war, or were there still some lingering tensions and disagreements?
Well, it marked the official end of World War II for Japan. The treaty wasn't without controversy. The Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia refused to sign it. Their objections stemmed from a variety of issues, including the treaty's recognition of the Republic of China, Taiwan, and its exclusion of the People's Republic of China, which was a major sticking point for the communist bloc.
So even the act of making peace was entangled with the complex geopolitics of the Cold War. What were some of the key provisions of the peace treaty, particularly those relating to the future of U.S. Japan relations?
The treaty addressed a range of issues, from territorial adjustments to reparations. It officially ended the state of war between Japan and the Allied powers and set the stage for Japan's reintegration into the international community. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the treaty, particularly in the long term, was its impact on U.S. Japan relations.
You mentioned the treaty's impact on U.S. Japan relations. Can you elaborate on that? How did it shape the dynamics between the two countries moving forward?
The treaty included provisions that allowed the U.S. to maintain military bases in Japan, including Okinawa. It also established a bilateral security pact, essentially placing Japan under the U.S. defense umbrella. This arrangement, initially driven by Cold War anxieties, has endured to this day and remains a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's amazing how the U.S. went from occupying and reforming Japan to embracing it as a key ally in just a few short years. What were some of the factors that led to this dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy?
The escalating Cold War played a major role. The rise of communism in China and elsewhere in Asia had the U.S. scrambling to contain Soviet influence. Japan, with its strategic location and growing economic potential, was seen as a crucial asset in this struggle. The Korean War further solidified this perception, highlighting Japan's importance as a logistics hub and a potential bulwark against communist expansion.
So the San Francisco Peace Treaty, while a landmark achievement in formally ending the war, also set in motion some long-term dynamics in U.S.-Japan relations that are worth examining.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that peace treaties, while intended to bring closure, often create new realities and challenges that shape the future in ways that are difficult to predict at the time.
It sounds like the peace treaty wasn't just about ending the war, it was about laying the foundation for a new era in U.S.-Japan relations.
Precisely. And that new era, forged in the crucible of the Cold War, has had profound implications for both countries as well as for the broader Asia-Pacific region.
Okay, let's take a step back and recap what we've covered so far. We've gone from the initial phase of punishment and reform to the economic revival driven by the reverse course, and culminating in the peace treaty that ushered in a new era of U.S.-Japan relations. It's been quite a journey.
It's a testament to how quickly global events can reshape a nation's destiny. In just 7 years, Japan underwent a transformation that's almost unparalleled in modern history. It went from a defeated militaristic empire to a burgeoning democracy and a key U.S. ally.
And all of this happened under the watchful eye of General Douglas MacArthur, a figure who looms large over this period. Was he ultimately a force for good or for ill in shaping Japan's post-war trajectory?
MacArthur. A complex and controversial figure, to be sure. There's no denying his pivotal role in shaping post-war Japan. His decisions, both brilliant and flawed, had a lasting impact on the nation's trajectory. But whether his legacy is ultimately positive or negative is a matter of debate, and historians continue to grapple with the complexities of his influence.
It sounds like MacArthur's role in this story is a prime example of how history is rarely black and white. It's often filled with shades of gray, with individuals and events defying easy categorization.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating to study. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about grappling with complex questions, considering multiple perspectives, and understanding how the past continues to shape the present.
Speaking of grappling with complex questions, let's shift our focus to the long-term consequences of the reverse course. It seems like this shift in U.S. policy, while driven by Cold War anxieties, may have had some unintended and perhaps less than desirable outcomes.
That's a topic that historians continue to debate. On one hand, the reverse course undoubtedly helped to rebuild the Japanese economy and solidify a key alliance against communism. On the other hand, some argue that it prioritized short-term stability over deeper societal reforms, potentially entrenching some of the very power structures the occupation initially sought to dismantle.
So while the reverse course may have been successful in achieving its immediate objectives, it also raises questions about the trade-offs involved and the potential for unintended consequences.
Exactly. And those consequences are still being felt today. For example, some argue that the close ties between government and big business, which the occupation initially tried to break up, actually persisted and even strengthened during the reverse course, leading to accusations of cronyism and a lack of transparency that continued to plague Japanese politics and economics.
So in a way, the reverse course may have sown the seeds for some of the challenges that Japan faces today. It's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have unforeseen and long-lasting ramifications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of critical thinking and historical analysis in understanding not just what happened in the past, but how those events continue to shape the world we live in today.
Okay, before we wrap up our deep dive into the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, I want to circle back to the question of whether the reverse course was ultimately the right decision. It seems like there are varied arguments on both sides of this issue.
That's the thing about history. There are rarely easy answers. The reverse course was a product of its time, shaped by the Cold War anxieties and the perceived need to contain communism in Asia. It had both positive and negative consequences, some intended, others unintended.
It seems like the real question isn't whether it was right or wrong, but rather what we can learn from it, both in terms of understanding the complexities of historical decision-making and in grappling with similar dilemmas that we face today.
Precisely. History doesn't offer simple solutions or clear-cut moral judgments. But it does provide a rich tapestry of experiences and insights that can help us navigate the complexities of the present and make more informed decisions about the future.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the present, shaping our institutions, our values, and our understanding of the world.
And that's why studying history is so essential. It's not just about learning about what happened long ago. It's about understanding who we are, where we come from, and the forces that continue to shape our world today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left wondering if there were any alternatives to the reverse course.
That's a question that continues to intrigue historians.
What might have happened if the U.S. had stuck to its initial goals of demilitarization and democratization?
Right.
Even in the face of Cold War pressures?
It's impossible to say for certain.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating thought experiment.
I agree.
Some historians argue that a more fully demilitarized Japan might have been less entangled in Cold War rivalries and potentially played a more independent role on the world stage.
But wouldn't that have left Japan vulnerable to external threats, especially from a communist China or Soviet Union?
That's certainly a possibility. But others argue that a more neutral Japan might have served as a bridge between East and West, potentially easing Cold War tensions. It's a counterfactual that's impossible to prove, but it raises important questions about the paths not taken.
And what about the economic consequences of a different approach? Would Japan have achieved the same level of economic prosperity without the close ties between government and big business that emerged during the reverse course?
That's another complex question.
Right.
Some argue that a more equitable distribution of wealth and power might have fostered a more sustainable and inclusive economic model. But others contend that the close collaboration between the government and the private sector was essential for Japan's rapid economic growth.
It seems like there's no easy answer to this question of what if, but it highlights the challenges of balancing competing priorities in foreign policy and the potential for unintended consequences, even when pursuing seemingly noble goals.
Exactly. History is full of these sorts of dilemmas, and it's up to us to study the past. Not to judge or to find simple answers, but to learn from the experiences of those who came before us.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the U.S. occupation and reconstruction of Japan, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
First, I think it's crucial to understand the profound impact of the occupation on Japan. It wasn't just a period of rebuilding. It was a time of radical transformation that shaped Japan's political, economic, and social landscape for decades to come.
It's like they hit the reset button on an entire nation.
In many ways, they did. And the consequences of those decisions are still being felt today.
And second, the reverse course, while driven by Cold War anxieties, raises important questions about the trade-offs inherent in foreign policy and the potential for unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is rarely linear or predictable. And that even the best-laid plans can have unforeseen outcomes.
Finally, I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of this period and the role of individuals like General MacArthur, who often operated in a world of ambiguity and uncertainty.
MacArthur was a flawed but fascinating figure. And his legacy is still debated today. He was a product of his time, shaped by his own experiences and the prevailing ideologies of the era.
It's a reminder that history is made by people.
It is.
And that understanding the motivations and decisions of key players is essential for grasping the bigger picture.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there are always multiple perspectives on historical events. The story of the occupation is not just an American story. It's a Japanese story, too. And it's essential to consider the experiences and viewpoints of all those involved.
So to our listener, we encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating period.
Absolutely.
Explore the primary sources, read the scholarship, and draw your own conclusions about the legacies of the occupation and the reverse course.
And as you do, remember that history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world and continue to influence our lives today.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you today. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of a truly pivotal period in history.
It was my pleasure. And to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the past.